Alex Carter had always thought of Willow Creek Estates as the perfect place to live. Nestled on the edge of a forest and bordered by a creek that wound lazily through the neighborhood, it was a peaceful sanctuary, a rare find in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The trees whispered in the breeze, the birds sang from the branches, and the creek flowed gently, providing a soothing soundtrack to daily life. For Alex, it was home. But something had changed, ever since the HOA had announced their new improvement project. For the creek, a lingering unease had taken root in Alex's gut. The board, led by the pompous Gerald Mason, had claimed the concrete barrier would enhance flood control and modernize the neighborhood. But Alex wasn't so sure. He'd watched the meetings, listened to the plans, and something about the whole project felt off. When the HOA had dismissed local environmental experts who warned about the dangers of blocking the creek, Alex's suspicions deepened. He had seen the looks the board members exchanged as they discussed the project behind closed doors. There was something in their eyes, something calculated. For weeks, Alex had tried to get answers. He'd raised questions at the meetings, wondering how the barrier could truly prevent flooding when it could block the creek's natural flow. But his concerns were quickly brushed aside with polite smiles and rehearsed answers. "Trust us, Alex," Gerald Mason had said one evening, his voice smooth, confident, the kind of tone that made you feel foolish for doubting him. "We're doing what's best for the entire community." But Alex wasn't convinced. Every evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows over the creek, Alex would stand by his window, staring out at the water that had always been a source of comfort to him. The creek had been there long before the houses, winding its way through the landscape in a dance older than any of them. It had seen floods, storms, and droughts, yet it always returned to calm. Alex had spent his childhood playing by its banks, skipping stones, and watching the water reflect the sky in a perfect mirror. The thought that the HOA would tamper with it, seal it off behind a concrete wall, left a bitter taste in his mouth. The project began quietly, too quietly. The workers arrived early in the morning, their trucks rolling in before the residents were awake. Day by day, the creek grew narrower, the water rising as the barrier took shape. But as the weeks passed, Alex noticed something strange. The water behind the barrier didn't move the way it should. It was stagnant, no longer flowing, accumulating with every drop of rain that fell. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A group of residents, concerned by the changes, began to talk in hushed tones. Some worried about flooding, others about the impact on local wildlife, but none of them had the courage to speak up. The HOA had made it clear that they didn't want anyone questioning their decisions. They controlled the neighborhood. They controlled the rules. And anyone who defied them risked becoming a target. But Alex couldn't let it go. As the concrete continued to rise, sealing the creek's fate, the sense of dread inside him grew stronger. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if anyone else could see it. But he could feel it. A storm, not just of weather, but of fate, one that was going to hit Willow Creek Estates hard. The sky seemed to darken with the weight of what was coming. The trees, once so reassuring, now stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind as if whispering warnings Alex couldn't hear. As the first heavy rainstorm in months hit the area, Alex felt the weight of the impending disaster press down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay silent, watching as the HOA continued with their project, blissfully unaware, or perhaps deliberately blind, to the catastrophe they were about to unleash. But one thing was certain. The storm wasn't just in the sky, it was coming for them all. The rain came down in torrents that night, tapping against Alex's windows like an ominous drumbeat. It had been weeks since the concrete barrier had been completed, but the creek behind Alex's house had never seemed more unnatural. The water, once clear and lively, was now an unnerving shade of brown, swirling in stagnant pools. The barrier, which was supposed to control floods, was already showing signs of strain. The creek, once so wild and free, now felt trapped, its natural flow blocked by something man-made and cold. Alex's phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor, Linda, who lived just a few doors down. Her message was simple but chilling. "Have you noticed the creek? It's rising faster than it should." Alex didn't respond immediately, too caught up in his own thoughts. He had spent the last few days researching, poring over environmental reports, and consulting with local experts who agreed that the HOA's plan was fundamentally flawed. Blocking a creek was never a good idea. It disrupted the delicate balance of water flow and could lead to catastrophic flooding downstream, where the neighborhood stood. Worse, the stagnant water behind the barrier was likely to breed dangerous bacteria and even increase the risk of mold, which would spread to homes as the wet conditions persisted. His mind raced with possibilities. Why was the HOA so insistent on pushing forward with this project? Were they truly unaware of the risks, or was there something else at play? The doubts gnawed at him. It was hard to ignore the fact that Gerald Mason, the HOA president, had been unusually smug about the whole thing. He'd smiled with that same reassuring, almost condescending expression whenever Alex brought up his concerns. "Trust us, Alex. We've got it all under control," he'd said, brushing him off as though Alex were some irrational worrywart. But the more Alex thought about it, the more he felt that the HOA wasn't just playing with the neighborhood's future. They were gambling with it. Suddenly, the sound of a loud cracking noise jolted him out of his thoughts. Alex rushed to his window, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared out into the darkness, where the creek was hidden behind trees and overgrown brush. The rain had intensified, the wind howling as if nature itself was reacting to the growing tension. Then another crack, louder this time. His breath caught in his throat. It was the concrete. He knew it was. Alex grabbed his flashlight and dashed out of his house, heart hammering with every step. He hurried down the street, the rain soaking through his jacket within moments. When he reached the edge of the creek, he stopped dead in his tracks. The water level had risen, already reaching the top of the barrier. Alex's pulse raced as he watched the first signs of the concrete cracking, hairline fractures forming along the edge. This wasn't normal. This wasn't supposed to happen. As he stood there, the sound of the cracks grew louder, like a sinister drumbeat echoing in the night. The creek, once an idyllic feature of the neighborhood, now seemed like a ticking time bomb. It had nowhere to go, trapped behind the barrier, waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, a roar of water surged forward, slamming against the concrete with terrifying force. Alex stumbled back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The floodgates were about to open. The worst-case scenario he feared was unfolding right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The rain intensified. The creek was rising faster than he had ever seen before, and the sound of the water against the concrete echoed like a warning. Then, from across the street, he heard voices, shouting, screaming. Linda and a few other neighbors had gathered, looking on in horror. "It's happening," Linda cried out. "The creek's going to break." Alex couldn't take his eyes off the creek. The once calm waters were now a ferocious force, swirling and churning, clawing at the concrete barrier as if it could sense its own doom. The night had become a nightmare, and Alex could only watch in helpless dread as the flood was about to be unleashed. Suspense hook. Would the barrier hold, or was this the beginning of the disaster Alex had been dreading? And if it did break, who would be left to pick up the pieces of a neighborhood forever changed? The rain didn't stop. It fell in sheets, relentless and unforgiving, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to drown Willow Creek estates. Alex stood frozen in place, watching the swollen creek churn violently beneath the concrete barrier. The sound of cracking continued, echoing through the night like the warning of an impending disaster. Each time the water surged against the barrier, the cracks widened, and Alex felt the ground beneath him tremble. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. It was happening. The flood he'd feared. The creek, once a gentle stream, had turned into a raging torrent, And the concrete barrier, supposed to protect them, was now the thing that would doom them all. Alex. Linda's voice cut through the rain. She was at the edge of her porch, her face pale with fear. Behind her, other neighbors had gathered, some in their pajamas, others in rain-soaked coats. The lights from their houses flickered as they watched the spectacle unfolding. No one dared to approach the creek. The danger was too close now, too real. "I don't think it's going to hold much longer," Alex shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible. The panic in his chest had begun to seep into his words. He'd warned them all, but no one had listened. The HOA had been too eager to improve the neighborhood. And now, they would all pay the price. Linda stepped forward, her voice cracking with urgency. "What do we do, Alex? We need to warn the others. The water's already rising." Alex's gaze locked onto the barrier. The creek had now fully breached its banks. As the water surged, it lapped at the cracks in the concrete, eating away at the edges like a hungry beast. The cracks widened, revealing the raw earth beneath the surface. With each new wave of water, the pressure mounted. Then there was a deafening sound, a roar followed by a terrifying crash. The first piece of concrete buckled and gave way, sending a cascade of water over the top. It was the sound of failure, of nature breaking free from the chains humans had placed on it. The barrier had cracked wide open. "Run!" Alex screamed, turning to the neighbors gathered behind him. "Get to higher ground now." But it was too late. The water poured through the breach like an unstoppable force, sweeping across the yard of the nearest home with ferocious speed. Alex's heart lurched as he watched the floodwaters rise, swallowing everything in its path. A few of the residents screamed, scrambling to grab what they could. But the flood was too fast, too powerful. He could see the terror in their faces as they realized just how quickly things were spiraling out of control. The water surged, rising higher and higher. Alex's eyes darted from house to house, realizing that the lower parts of the neighborhood would be the first to suffer. The homes closest to the creek would be submerged within minutes. He grabbed Linda's arm and yanked her toward higher ground, but the weight of what was happening, what was unfolding, pressed down on him like a physical force. There was no time to save everything, no time to warn everyone. The flood was here, and the neighborhood they once knew was gone. The HOA's promises of safety had turned to ashes, and now, as the water swallowed the streets, Alex felt the weight of their negligence crashing down. His thoughts raced. Could this have been avoided? Had anyone truly believed him when he said the creek needed to flow freely? The more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. This wasn't just an accident. This was a disaster waiting to happen, and the HOA had ignored every warning. As the water surged over the edge, Alex looked toward the homes that were now drowning beneath the flood. The concrete barrier had failed them. The damage was done. There was no going back now. Suspense hook. Would anyone survive this unrelenting flood? And as the waters rose, what was left to save? Would the HOA take responsibility, or would they continue to lie to cover up their catastrophic mistake? The floodwaters tore through Willow Creek Estates with unstoppable force, sweeping everything in its path. The streets, once neat and orderly, were now chaotic rivers of brown water, carrying debris, barked trees, overturned cars, and the remnants of fences downstream. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he helped Linda to higher ground, his eyes flickering from house to house, watching as the once beautiful neighborhood was consumed by the flood. "Alex, we need to get out of here," Linda gasped, her voice trembling. She clung to him, fear written on her face. "The water's coming for us." But Alex could only stare at the destruction unfolding before him. The creek had been tamed, blocked off by a concrete wall that was supposed to protect them. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The storm raged, rain continuing to fall like a hammer against the world, and the creek behind them. The same creek Alex had grown up beside, had become an enemy. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out everything else. The barrier was now just a broken shell of concrete, pieces of it floating in the flood, torn apart by the sheer power of the water. Every moment, more of the neighborhood was submerged, and the destruction seemed to intensify with each passing second. The water was rising faster than anyone could have anticipated. "Look," Linda cried, pointing toward the cracked barrier. "It's worse than I thought. The whole creek's going to breach." Alex felt his stomach twist. The water was rising behind the failed barrier with terrifying speed. What had once been a peaceful trickle was now a monstrous wave, slamming against the concrete with no mercy. The cracks had spread, widening until the entire section of the barrier near the center had collapsed, sending a roar of water into the streets below. It felt like the entire world had given way, as if the land beneath them was crumbling into chaos. "Everyone needs to get to the hills," Alex shouted to the other residents, who had gathered along the road, their faces pale with panic. "Get out of here, now." But the flood was moving too quickly. People scrambled, some in a blind panic, others frozen with terror, unsure of what to do. Alex turned, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything that might signal hope, but all he saw was more devastation. Then in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing in the rain, watching from the edge of his flooded property. Gerald Mason, the president of the HOA, his suit soaked through, looked like a man who had just realized he had lost everything. His eyes locked with Alex's, and for a moment, there was no mistaking the look in his gaze. It was the same expression Alex had seen countless times in HOA meetings, the same smug assurance that the board had everything under control. But now, it was gone. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the confidence. In its place was pure, unfiltered fear. "Gerald," Alex called out, his voice rising above the roar of the storm. "What have you done?" Mason didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked night, leaving Alex to confront the reality that the man who had pushed for this improvement was now nowhere to be found when it mattered most. The HOA, with all their promises, had failed. The barrier had failed. And now, the flood was taking its toll on everything. Alex's mind raced as the flood surged, pushing water into homes and past his feet. The community that had once been a peaceful refuge was now a disaster zone. But what struck him most in that moment was the sickening realization. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a man-made catastrophe, a result of greed and negligence, and the neighborhood would bear the cost for the HOA's arrogance. The thought made his blood run cold. But there was one thing Alex was sure of: the people who had done this would pay. Suspense hook. Would Alex be able to stop the HOA from escaping responsibility? Or was this flood only the beginning of something much more dangerous, a conspiracy that would consume them all? The floodwaters surged around Alex, and the rain continued to pour down in sheets, as if nature itself was washing away the mistakes of those who had come before. The once peaceful streets of Willow Creek Estates were now a churning mass of water and debris, a chaotic reminder of how quickly things could fall apart. But even as the storm raged, something darker loomed over the neighborhood. Alex's eyes flicked toward the abandoned homes, their lower floors already submerged, the lights flickering in a desperate final attempt to stay alive. His mind was racing. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. People were going to lose everything. Homes, memories, the lives they had worked so hard to build. But as he looked back toward the creek, a burning question clawed at him. Was this just a mistake? Or was there something more sinister at play here? "Alex, we need to move," Linda shouted from behind him, snapping him back to reality. Her face was pale, her hair plastered to her face with rain, but her eyes were fierce. "We can't stay here. The water's still rising." Alex shook his head, glancing once more toward Gerald Mason, who had disappeared into the night. He could feel the raw fury building in his chest. Gerald had played them all, sold them a lie, and now they were paying the price for it. The barrier had been a lie. The flood, this disaster, it was all a lie. The water rising faster, swallowing homes. This wasn't natural. It was sabotage. It had to be. Alex's blood ran cold as a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the HOA had known all along? What if they wanted this to happen? He whispered to himself, though Linda was too far away to hear him over the storm. The more Alex thought about it, the more it made sense. The constant dismissals of concerns. The way the HOA had steamrolled over local experts and ignored every red flag about the creek's natural flow. The haste with which they had rushed the project without listening to the people who knew what they were doing. All the pieces were falling into place, but the truth was more twisted than he had imagined. The HOA wasn't just negligent. They were actively complicit in the destruction. As the floodwater crept higher, reaching the knees of the residents trying to salvage what they could, Alex realized there was no time to waste. The town needed answers, but more than that, the HOA needed to be held accountable. Alex, Linda called again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. We have to go. There's nothing more we can do here. We need to get to the shelters before it's too late. She was right. People were evacuating, but the path to safety was growing more treacherous by the minute. The flood had turned the streets into raging rivers, carrying everything in their path. Vehicles had been flipped over, and fences had been torn apart, all while the sound of the creek's fury echoed in the distance. But Alex couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. The HOA had to be stopped. There were too many lives at risk, too many unanswered questions. His eyes turned back to the wreckage of the barrier, the broken concrete floating in the rising water. He had no idea where Gerald Mason had gone, but he knew one thing. The man had left the community to drown in its own mistakes, and that wasn't something Alex would let go of. He grabbed Linda's arm once more, pulling her toward a higher point in the neighborhood. But even as he moved, his thoughts were already shifting toward the next step, the next battle. He would find the truth. He would expose the HOA for what they had done. And they would pay for their crimes. Suspense hook. Could Alex gather enough evidence to bring the HOA to justice? Or would they continue to hide behind their power, leaving the residents of Willow Creek Estates to drown in their own destruction? The storm raged on, relentless, as Alex and Linda pushed through the flooded streets. The water had now swallowed most of the neighborhood, and what had once been a vibrant community was rapidly turning into a nightmare. The floodwaters surged with fury, crashing against homes, pulling away cars and fences, and carrying away the memories of a place that had once felt safe. But despite the chaos around him, Alex couldn't shake the burning need for answers. There was something deep inside him that told him this wasn't just a tragic accident. This was the result of something more sinister, something intentional. As they reached a small rise in the neighborhood, the water starting to recede in the areas further upstream, Alex stopped, staring out over the devastation. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the broken barrier that had failed so catastrophically. Every minute he stood there, the weight of the situation pressed harder against him. Alex, we can't just stand here. Linda's voice cut through his thoughts, her words full of concern. We need to get to the shelters. There are people there who need help. I know, Alex muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. The nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't let him go. But I can't just let this go. Someone has to take responsibility for what's happened. Linda's expression shifted to one of disbelief. You really think the HOA's behind this? I mean, come on, they couldn't have meant for this to happen, right? Alex turned toward her, his eyes burning with determination. I don't think it was a mistake. I think this was planned. The way they ignored the experts, the way they rushed the project. It's all too perfect, too convenient. They wanted this to happen. Linda's face hardened with realization. You think they wanted the flood? Alex nodded grimly. I do. It's not just about the creek anymore. It's about something bigger. The HOA has been quietly pushing for development. Bigger houses, more expensive properties, a luxury neighborhood. And they knew this flood would bring that about. They'd been buying up properties around here for months. They wanted the land, and now they've got the perfect excuse to tear down what's left. A chill ran down Linda's spine. She stared at Alex as if he had just revealed something she didn't want to believe. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had seen the signs, the subtle ways the HOA had worked behind the scenes, the way they had brushed off concerns. It all added up. But how could they prove it? How could they take down an organization that had so much power and influence in the community? Alex, Linda said quietly, we can't do this alone. We need help. I know, Alex replied, his voice resolute. I'm not going to let them get away with it. They've already ruined lives. Now it's time to make them pay. But just as Alex's resolve began to harden, something caught his eye, a figure moving through the rain-soaked streets. It was a man, tall and cloaked, walking through the debris with purposeful strides. His features were obscured by the downpour, but there was no mistaking his movement. It was Gerald Mason. Alex's pulse quickened as he stepped forward, blocking the path between Gerald and the distant shelter. Mason, he called out, his voice sharp with accusation. The man paused, but didn't turn. What do you want, Carter? Gerald's voice was cold, almost indifferent. You've ruined everything. Alex's anger bubbled over. You and your HOA. You pushed this project through, knowing the risks. And now people are losing their homes. People are losing their lives. Gerald didn't flinch. Instead, he looked over his shoulder toward the broken barrier, his face hard and unreadable. You don't understand, he said quietly, as though it was all some twisted, rehearsed mantra. We did what needed to be done. The property value here was stagnant. This was a necessary evil. You'll see. In the end, it'll be worth it. Alex's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, like a poison that seeped into his bones. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. Gerald Mason had orchestrated this flood. And now he was standing there, justifying it. It was all a game to him. The homes, the people, it was all expendable in the name of profit. People are drowning, Gerald, Alex said, his voice hoarse with disgust. And you're talking about property value. Gerald finally turned, a twisted smile crossing his lips. Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm, leaving Alex and Linda standing in stunned silence. Suspense hook. Was this the moment Alex had been waiting for? The truth finally revealed. Or was it just the beginning of a much darker conspiracy that would change everything they thought they knew? And more importantly, could Alex stop Gerald Mason before the HOA had destroyed everything in its path? The storm was still raging, but in the heart of Willow Creek Estates, something else was stirring, an unstoppable force rising from the wreckage of the flood. Alex stood, breathless, as Gerald Mason disappeared into the night, his cruel words echoing in Alex's mind. Break a few eggs to make an omelet. The phrase haunted him, like a curse, as if it encapsulated everything wrong with the HOA and everything they had done to this once quiet neighborhood. Alex, we can't just stand here. Linda's voice broke through his dark thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Her eyes were wide, her voice trembling with anxiety. You need to do something. We need to act before more lives are lost. Alex nodded, the fire of determination igniting in his chest. They couldn't wait for help. They couldn't wait for the authorities to sort this out. The HOA had done enough damage, and now it was time to fight back. He had to expose them. He had to make sure the people behind this catastrophe paid for their actions. But how? With the flood waters still rising and most of the town now submerged, who would believe him? Who could he trust? His eyes scanned the horizon. There was no sign of Gerald Mason, no sign of the HOA's henchmen, but Alex knew they would be back, lurking in the shadows, watching from afar. They couldn't hide forever. If he played this right, he could turn the tide, use their own secrets against them. Suddenly, a thought struck him with the force of lightning. The HOA had been sneaky, manipulating the local government, quietly buying land around the neighborhood for months. But what if they weren't just manipulating property? What if they had been involved in other, darker dealings? They hadn't just been covering up the flood damage. They had to be covering up something bigger. Linda tugged at his arm, her eyes filled with concern. "Alex, we need to move now. I saw some people heading toward the emergency shelters. We should." "I know," Alex interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. "But I can't let this go. I need to find something. I need proof." Linda hesitated, but then nodded in reluctant agreement. She could see the determination in his eyes, the same fire that had fueled him to push for the truth when everyone else had been content to ignore it. She knew Alex was right. The only way to stop the HOA now was to expose them for what they were: greedy, manipulative, and, worse yet, responsible for this disaster. Alex's mind raced. Where could he find the answers? Then it hit him: the HOA's records. They had to be kept somewhere. Somewhere hidden. "Linda, the HOA's office. We need to get to their records. If we can find the documents that show what they've been planning, who they've been bribing, then we'll have them. It's the only way to stop them." Linda's face went pale, but she nodded. "Let's go. But we need to hurry." They began to move, dodging debris and trying to keep their footing as the floodwaters continued to encroach. The entire neighborhood was crumbling around them. They reached the heart of the subdivision, where the HOA office had once stood as a symbol of power and authority. The building was now a ruin, half sunk into the rising waters. It was eerily quiet. Alex scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. There was no sign of the HOA officials, no sign of anyone coming to clean up the mess they'd left behind. It was as if they had all disappeared, vanished into thin air, leaving the residents to drown in the mess they had created. But Alex wasn't going to let them get away. He moved quickly, rushing toward the building's back entrance, the door still ajar. The interior was dark, littered with broken glass and papers soaked by the flood. But Alex had no time to waste. He tore through the wreckage, searching through wet files, slamming through cabinets, desperate to find something, anything, that would prove what he had suspected all along. And then, as if fate had intervened, his hand brushed against a soaked folder in the corner. He pulled it out, flipping it open with shaking hands. There on the pages was the proof he'd been waiting for: documents detailing bribes, illegal land acquisitions, and most chilling of all, a list of insider deals between the HOA and high-ranking officials. The flood had been orchestrated to drive up property values, to clear the way for more development. "Linda," Alex gasped, holding up the folder, his voice shaking with triumph. "I've got it. I've got the proof. They planned this. They knew it was going to happen." Linda stepped forward, her eyes wide as she saw the evidence laid out before them. For a moment, the two of them stood there, breathing heavily, their hearts racing with a mixture of disbelief and victory. But their victory was short-lived. Suddenly, a loud crack rang out from behind them. Suspense hook. Someone was coming. Someone who didn't want these secrets to be exposed. Would Alex and Linda be able to escape with the proof before they were caught? Or would the HOA's enforcers silence them forever? The crack of thunder seemed to echo through the wreckage of the HOA office, sending a chill down Alex's spine. His heart raced as the papers in his hands, the damning evidence, fluttered with every breath he took. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate, slicing through the deepening storm like a predator closing in on its prey. Alex's pulse quickened. He didn't have much time. The documents were his only leverage, and if the HOA's enforcers caught them before they could get away, It would all be over. He could already feel the cold grip of fear wrapping around his chest as he glanced nervously over his shoulder, trying to make out who was approaching through the shadows. "Linda," Alex whispered urgently, his voice tight with panic. "We need to move now." Linda's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Alex, her face pale and determined. "Where do we go? We can't outrun them in this storm." "We don't have to outrun them. We just need to make it to the safe house," Alex replied, his mind already racing through options. The safe house, the one place the HOA couldn't reach them. He had a contact there, someone who knew the truth and was waiting to help expose everything. But it was on the outskirts of town. They couldn't waste any more time. As they moved toward the back exit, the door slammed open. Gerald Mason stepped into the room, his drenched suit clinging to his frame, his face twisted in a mask of cold fury. Behind him, two of the HOA's hired goons followed, their eyes scanning the debris-filled room, zeroing in on Alex and Linda. "Don't even think about running," Gerald sneered, his voice low but dripping with menace. "You've got nowhere to go, Carter. Nowhere." Alex's blood ran cold as he locked eyes with Gerald. He could see the desperation in the HOA president's eyes, the panic that was simmering beneath the surface. Gerald had no intention of letting them leave with the evidence. Not now. Not ever. "You can't stop this, Mason," Alex said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "It's already over. You can't hide it. The truth is out." Gerald's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, his eyes darkening with a dangerous gleam. "You really think anyone will believe you? You think this little paper trail will be enough to take us down? You don't understand how far this goes. You're just a nuisance." Alex held up the folder, the pages glistening under the flickering light of the broken overhead lamps. "This isn't just a paper trail. It's proof. Proof that you planned this flood. Proof of the bribes. And proof that you've been using the HOA to line your pockets at the expense of this entire community." Gerald's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alex could have sworn he saw a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. "You're making a mistake, Carter," Gerald said, his voice growing darker. "The storm's already here. You're not going to stop it. And you're not going to stop us." Before Alex could respond, the two goons lunged toward them. One grabbed Alex by the arm, yanking him back toward the broken desk, while the other moved to seize the folder from Linda's grasp. But Linda wasn't about to let them win. With a surge of adrenaline, she kicked the man in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. She grabbed Alex's arm, pulling him free from the other goon's grip. "Now," Linda shouted, her voice cracking as she shoved the folder into Alex's hands. They bolted toward the back exit, their feet splashing through the water that had pooled across the floor. The goons were right behind them, but Alex and Linda had the advantage of desperation. With every step, Alex's mind raced. The safe house was just ahead. If they could make it there, they could expose everything, bring down the HOA for good. But Gerald and his men were relentless, and the storm was only making things worse. As they neared the door, a gunshot rang out. The deafening crack sent a shock of terror through Alex, but he didn't stop. They were almost there. The safe house was just beyond the gates of the neighborhood, hidden in the thick woods. It was their last hope. Just as the goons reached the back exit, Alex shoved the door open, and they burst into the rain-soaked night, the storm howling around them. Behind them, they could hear the growls of pursuit, but the distance between them and the HOA's enforcers was growing. They were close. So close. Suspense hook. Would Alex and Linda make it to safety with the evidence that could bring down the HOA, or would they be stopped before they could expose the truth? Could the storm be the final weapon in a battle that would decide the fate of Willow Creek Estates forever?